A Mustang horse, abandoned in the middle of the desert, blind and helpless, was left to wander alone. His owner, a farmer, decided the horse was no longer useful and cast him aside, thinking he was as good as dead. But then, something miraculous happened. A stranger appeared, and what followed would challenge everything we know about courage, hope, and the unbreakable bond between man and animal. Under the harsh, unforgiving heat of the desert sun, the Mustang, named Dakota, limped across the dry, cracked earth. His once strong, proud frame now seemed frail, and each step he took was slower than the last. The wild spirit that once roamed the mountains with strength and freedom had faded. Now, he was a mere shadow of his former self. Blindness had stolen his ability to see the world, and with it, his ability to survive in the harsh wilderness. Far away, standing on the porch of his farmhouse, Jack Miller stared at the animal with a cold, calculating gaze. He had watched Dakota struggle for weeks, unable to keep up with the herd or perform the work expected of him. His days of running wild through the plains were over. Dakota was no longer useful. The rancher's decision was already made. Even though it pained him to admit it, Dakota wouldn't last long on his own, and it was unlikely anyone else would take him in. Jack had seen too many animals come and go, and too many difficult decisions made in the name of practicality. Once a proud wild horse, Dakota was now nothing more than a burden. "You've outlived your usefulness," Jack muttered as he slowly approached the Mustang. His voice was rough, but a hint of sadness was buried deep beneath the harsh words. He reached for the lead rope, his hand steady, almost mechanical in its movements. With a firm tug, he pulled the rope toward him, and Dakota shuffled forward, his steps unsteady. Dakota could feel the pull, but had no sense of direction. He had been blind for weeks, and it felt as though the world had slipped away, leaving him lost in darkness. He stumbled, feeling his way forward with labored breathing. The sand beneath his hooves felt foreign, as if the ground was rejecting him. He was alone, truly alone, and he knew it. Jack's eyes narrowed as he tugged the rope again. "Time for you to go, old friend," he said, his voice low, almost a whisper. The words hung in the air like a bitter truth. It was a decision Jack had been dreading for days, but now it was time to act. The farm had always been a tough place to live, with constant struggles against drought and financial strain. Every animal had to serve a purpose, but Dakota no longer had one. Jack could no longer afford to feed and care for a blind Mustang who couldn't contribute to the work on the land. He had already made up his mind. "You're better off out there," Jack muttered, almost as if talking to himself. He pulled the rope harder, urging Dakota to follow him. As they reached the edge of the property, the Mustang stumbled behind, his movements slow and unsure. He had been pushed to the edge, and now Jack was showing him the way out. But Dakota didn't fight back. He didn't resist. Something deep within him told him this was the end of the line. He had never been good at following orders, but now, in his blindness, he could not do anything but follow the man who had once cared for him. The path ahead seemed dark and endless, and the oppressive heat of the desert air filled his lungs. Jack opened the gate and gestured for Dakota to pass through. "Go on," he said, his voice hard. "Find somewhere else to die." As the gate creaked, closed behind them, Jack watched as the Mustang limped away, disappearing into the distance toward the barren wilderness that stretched endlessly before them. He stood there momentarily, hands on his hips, watching the animal disappear into the horizon. For a brief, fleeting moment, a pang of regret hit Jack's heart, but it was quickly buried beneath the harshness of reality. Dakota had always been a wild horse, a creature of the open plains. Now he was destined to die alone in the unforgiving desert. Jackson had done what he thought was necessary, but little did he know that this wasn't the end for Dakota. Something incredible was about to happen, something that would defy all expectations. Dakota continued his painful journey as the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting a warm orange glow across the barren desert. The weight of his blindness pressed down on him, but he had no choice but to push forward. His hooves scraped against the dry ground, each step more hesitant than the last. His once graceful gait had become a shuffle, as if the earth was pulling him down, mocking his weakness. The silence of the desert was overwhelming. No sounds of other animals, no whispers of the wind, just the rhythmic sound of his hooves dragging along the sand. He felt vulnerable, exposed to the vast emptiness around him. Every instinct in his body screamed for him to fight, to find shelter or food. But his mind, clouded by the darkness of his sightless world, couldn't focus. There was no escape from the growing ache in his chest, the weight of loneliness pressing harder with each step. Once wild and untamed, it seemed to wither with every passing moment. He had been abandoned, cast out by the very person who had once cared for him. Jackson had given him no second thought, pushing him into the unforgiving desert to fend for himself. It was a cruel, heartless decision. But Dakota couldn't blame him. Jackson had his struggles, his burdens to bear. The farm needed workers, animals that could perform, and Dakota no longer fit that role. As night began to fall, Dakota stumbled across the remnants of an old, abandoned water trough. He had no idea how long it had been there, but he was desperate. His dry, cracked lips ached for a drink. He approached the trough cautiously, using his heightened sense of smell to guide him. The water was stagnant, the surface still and dark, but it was water nonetheless. He lowered his head, taking a slow, hesitant drink. The coolness of the water seemed to revive him. If only for a moment. He stood there quietly, drinking, his mind racing with 1,000 thoughts. Was this truly the end? Would he die here alone? In the desert, a faint noise reached his ears, a whisper in the wind. It wasn't much, but it was enough to stir his senses. He froze, his ears pricking up as he tried to make sense of the sound. It wasn't the rustle of the wind nor the distant call of a bird. It was something else, something alive. A soft rustling in the distance grew louder, and Dakota's instincts kicked in. He tensed his body, ready for whatever came next. But instead of the danger he had prepared for, a gentle voice broke the silence. "You're a long way from home, aren't you, old friend?" Dakota's heart skipped a beat. The voice was unfamiliar, but there was warmth in it, a kindness that cut through the isolation he had been feeling. He lifted his head, his ears straining to hear more. But the voice had stopped. He was not alone. The sound of hooves on the dry earth grew louder and closer. Dakota's heart pounded in his chest. Who was this? Another horse? A person? Then, from the shadows of the desert night, a figure appeared. The silhouette of a horse, strong and tall, emerged from the darkness, its eyes gleaming in the moonlight, a sharp contrast to Dakota's blind, empty gaze. The new horse circled him cautiously, its presence calm but unwavering. For a moment, Dakota didn't know what to do. He had spent so long in isolation, trusting no one. But this was different. The new horse wasn't threatening. In fact, there was something comforting about its presence. "Hey, don't be scared," the voice came again, clearer this time. Dakota felt the warmth of the words wash over him, soothing his anxiety. "I'm not here to hurt you." Though Dakota couldn't see, he could sense the kindness in the voice. It wasn't an animalistic instinct, but a deep, human-like understanding that transcended the usual communication between horses. He wanted to trust, but the weight of his loneliness held him back. The new horse took another step closer, and this time, Dakota could smell the fresh scent of grass and rain on the other animal familiar. Smells of life and nature, things he hadn't experienced in so long. It made him want to close his eyes and let go of the fear that had gripped him for so long. The other horse stood still for a moment, and then, almost as if to say goodbye, gently touched its nose to Dakota's side. It was a gesture of understanding, of camaraderie. Then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the mysterious horse turned and vanished back into the shadows of the desert. Dakota was left standing alone once more, but something had shifted within him. For the first time in days, he felt like there was hope. He wasn't abandoned entirely. He wasn't forgotten. The days that followed were a blur of confusion for Dakota. It was as if he had stepped into a new world, one where he was no longer alone, but one where he couldn't see what lay before him. His blind eyes, though unable to process the world around him, seemed to understand that something had changed. The sense of isolation that had once dominated Dakota's existence began to recede, replaced by a quiet curiosity. He didn't know who the mysterious horse was or why it had come to him in the desert, but the encounter lingered in his mind. It was a fleeting moment of connection, yet it was enough to stir something deep within his heart. Dakota had always been a solitary creature, proud and independent, but that brief contact had awakened something in him that he hadn't known he had lost. His days were still long and filled with uncertainty, but now, when night fell and the winds howled through the empty desert, Dakota didn't feel quite so alone. He had hope. The desert, however, wasn't kind to those who didn't belong. The days were harsh, the sun unforgiving, and food and water were scarce. For Dakota, each step was a struggle. His legs ached with the constant strain, and his body, once strong and proud, now felt weak. But he kept moving. He had no other choice. It was during one of these long, exhausting days that Dakota felt the strange presence again. This time, the sound of hooves wasn't distant. It was close. He turned his head toward the sound, unsure of what to expect. His heart skipped a beat as he realized it was the same horse from before. The figure emerged from the shadows, moving with grace through the sand. Its coat gleamed under the harsh sunlight, a stark contrast to Dakota's dirt-smeared hide. But it wasn't the horse's appearance that caught Dakota's attention. It was the undeniable feeling that the animal was here for him. "You're still here," Dakota whispered to himself, though he knew the horse couldn't hear him. The mysterious horse approached carefully, its eyes locking onto Dakota's empty gaze. For a moment, the world around them seemed to disappear, leaving only the two of them standing in the vast, empty desert. The connection was undeniable, an unspoken understanding that transcended the physical world. It was as if the bond between them had been forged long before they had met in some distant, forgotten place. The other horse gently nudged Dakota's shoulder with its nose, an unspoken invitation. Without thinking, Dakota took a hesitant step forward. The movement was slow and careful, but something was comforting in the presence of the other horse, something that made him feel safe, something he hadn't felt in so long. For the first time in days, Dakota felt the urge to run, to feel the wind in his mane and the ground beneath his hooves. His legs trembled with the weight of the desire, but he was unsure. Would he be able to keep up? Would his body betray him again? The other horse seemed to sense his hesitation and turned back toward the horizon, its tail flicking in the air as if beckoning him to follow. It moved with ease, its every step sure and confident. It was as if the world had opened up before it, and it knew where it was going. Dakota, despite the uncertainty in his body, took a deep breath and followed. With each step, the gap between them closed, and he felt a strange sense of peace settle over him. The connection between the two horses strengthened with every moment. The other horse wasn't just a guide. It was a companion, a lifeline that pulled him through the desert's harsh grip. But even with this newfound sense of purpose, Dakota couldn't help but wonder, what was this bond they shared? Was it mere coincidence, or was there something deeper at play? His blind eyes couldn't provide the answers, but the sense of unity he felt was undeniable. Together, the two horses moved through the desert side by side. The sun dipped low in the sky, casting long shadows across the endless expanse of sand. Dakota's heart beat in rhythm, with the other horses, a shared pulse that connected them in ways words never could. The journey through the desert continued, each day blurring into the next. Dakota's body ached, his muscles worn thin from the constant strain, but he pressed forward. The presence of the other horse was a constant source of strength. Its companionship, quiet but unwavering, gave Dakota the will to keep moving despite the exhaustion. As the days passed, Dakota grew more accustomed to the presence of the other horse. Their bond deepened. It was almost as if they could communicate without words. Each nudge, each glance, each shared moment of silence spoke volumes. But despite this growing connection, Dakota couldn't ignore the fact that they were still in the desert, with little food and water to sustain them. One morning, as the sun began to rise, Dakota's body felt heavier than usual. His limbs were stiff, his breathing shallow. The desert's relentless heat had begun to take its toll, and the absence of nourishment was starting to show. He could feel his strength waning, and the realization hit him hard. They had no direction, no destination. It was just the desert, an unforgiving landscape that offered no mercy. The distant mirage of a cool oasis was nothing more than an illusion, a cruel trick of the mind. Dakota knew that without food and water, it wouldn't be long before he collapsed. His thoughts turned to the other horse. Was it truly strong enough to continue? Was it willing to keep going with him, even if it meant certain death? Dakota didn't know, but he couldn't allow himself to become a burden. Blind Mustangs were often left behind, discarded in the wild when they no longer served a purpose. Dakota feared he, too, would be forgotten in the vastness of the desert. The other horse, sensing his weariness, paused and turned back toward him. Its dark eyes seemed to shine with understanding, as though it had known all along that this moment would come. Dakota's legs trembled as he stumbled forward, but the horse did not leave him behind. Instead, it stopped and waited. "Why are you waiting for me?" Dakota whispered hoarsely, his voice barely audible in the still desert air. He wasn't sure if he expected an answer, but the other horse only gazed at him unwaveringly. The bond between them was stronger than ever. Dakota's knees buckled beneath him, and he collapsed to the ground, his body too weak to keep standing. The sun, relentless in its heat, beat down on him, but the other horse stayed close. Standing over him like a guardian, Dakota could feel its presence, strong and protective. It was a silent promise this horse wouldn't leave him behind. But despite the comforting presence of the other horse, Dakota knew that they were running out of time. The desert was unforgiving, and his strength was rapidly depleting. He closed his eyes, surrendering to the exhaustion, but even in his weakened state, he could still feel the unspoken promise, the shared determination to survive. As the day wore on, Dakota's body burned with fever, his mind clouded by exhaustion. The desert had claimed many before him, and he feared it would claim him too. The thought of dying alone in this barren place, forgotten and abandoned, was almost too much to bear. But the other horse remained by his side, a steadfast companion. In the face of death, it didn't leave him, and in that moment, Dakota realized he wasn't alone. The two of them, both blind in their way, had found each other in the most unlikely of places. And perhaps, just perhaps, that was enough to survive. As the sun set behind them, casting a warm glow across the horizon, Dakota struggled to stay awake. His thoughts began to fade, slipping into unconsciousness. But even as he drifted, he knew one thing for certain: he wasn't alone. He had found a companion, and that companion had become his reason to keep going. The connection between them was more than just physical. It was something deeper, something beyond the limitations of sight or sound. It was a bond of trust, of survival, of love. And that, Dakota realized, was more than enough to keep fighting. The desert air grew colder. As night approached, Dakota lay on the ground, his body still burning with fever. But the presence of the other horse kept him grounded, both physically and emotionally. It was as if the horse knew exactly what Dakota needed, never leaving his side, never once faltering. In its quiet vigilance, as the hours passed, the desert's night began to creep in, bringing with it a surprising sense of calm. The once brutal sun that had scorched the earth during the day was now replaced by a cooler, starlit sky. The desert was still, save for the occasional rustle of dry brush in the wind. Dakota's body was exhausted, but his mind was far from at rest. In his feverish state, he began to experience strange thoughts and fleeting dreams. He saw flashes of his past memories of running free, galloping across wide-open plains with his herd. Unburdened and unchained, those days now seemed like distant memories, ones he could never fully return to. The images became more vivid as his mind wandered deeper. Suddenly, he remembered something, a fragment of a conversation with the rancher, the one who had abandoned him here. "You were nothing but trouble from the start," the words echoed in his mind. Dakota's heart raced as he realized that his abandonment hadn't been an unfortunate accident. It had been a deliberate decision, but there was more to it. He remembered the rancher's face, clouded with anger. The man had said something else, something that haunted him. "You'll never find your way home. You're too weak. You'll die here in the desert." Dakota's chest tightened at the memory. He had been cast out as useless, discarded like a broken tool. But he wasn't broken. He was still alive. His thoughts were interrupted by a soft sound, an almost imperceptible nicker from the other horse. Dakota turned his head toward the sound. His vision was blurry and weak, but he could still make out the shape of the horse standing just a few feet away. The horse's eyes glinted in the moonlight, an expression that seemed almost knowing, as if the horse was aware of his realization. For the first time, Dakota felt something shift in the air. It was a strange sensation, like the stillness of the desert had been broken by an invisible force. Something in the air felt different, as if a door had opened to a new possibility. The other horse stepped closer, its body warm against Dakota's. He could feel its breath on his skin, gentle but insistent, like a silent invitation. Without thinking, Dakota reached out, his fingers brushing against the horse's mane. The touch was electric, the connection instant and undeniable. As he held onto the horse, the weight of the desert seemed to lift, even if just for a moment. He realized that the desert wasn't just a physical space, it was a mental barrier, one that he had to overcome. He had been abandoned and left to die, but that didn't define him. He wasn't just a blind Mustang, he was a survivor. The wind picked up slightly, rustling the sand around them. Dakota felt something stir deep within him, a sense of purpose, a drive he hadn't felt in a long time. It was as if the desert had broken him down to his core, only to reveal something stronger, something that could not be extinguished. He was no longer alone, no longer just a forgotten creature wandering the endless expanse of sand. He had found his strength, not just in the horse beside him, but in himself. The other horse had been his guide, a companion through the darkest moments. But Dakota now knew that it was he who would lead them both to survival. The realization settled into his bones like a newfound resolve. He wasn't just trying to survive anymore. He was determined to live, and that, he knew, was the key to overcoming whatever challenges lay ahead. As he lay back down, the stars above him seemed to shine brighter. For the first time since he had been abandoned, he felt a glimmer of hope. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep him going. With the other horse by his side, Dakota believed that anything was possible. As dawn broke over the desert, its first light spread across the sandy expanse like a blanket of hope. Dakota's body ached, the fever still lingering, but his mind was clearer. The night had passed, and with it, something inside him had shifted. He no longer felt the weight of his past nor the crushing isolation of being abandoned. The desert, once a prison, now seemed to offer him a chance to prove himself, to reclaim his life. The other horse stood beside him, its dark coat glistening under the early morning sun. Its eyes met Dakota's, unwavering, as if silently encouraging him to rise. The bond between them had deepened overnight. What had once been a simple act of companionship had become a partnership, a shared determination to survive. But there was still one last challenge, one final test before Dakota could leave this place. The desert was vast and unforgiving, and there was no easy path out. He would have to rely on his instincts, his strength, and the unexpected ally beside him to find his way. Despite the uncertainty that lay ahead, Dakota felt ready. He had faced the darkness of his fears, and in doing so, he had found something he thought was lost forever: hope. He staggered to his feet, his legs unsteady but resolute. The other horse stepped forward, its powerful body a steadying force. They moved together, side by side, toward the horizon. The air was still. The only sound was the crunch of sand beneath their hooves. The desert seemed to stretch endlessly, a sea of sand with no end in sight. The heat was already beginning to rise, but Dakota pressed on, his focus sharp. Each step was an act of defiance, a statement that he wouldn't let the world break him. Hours passed, and the harsh reality of the desert began to set in. The sun beat down relentlessly, and Dakota could feel the toll it was taking on his body. His throat was dry, his energy slowly draining. But the other horse never wavered, always there beside him, a silent support that helped him keep moving. As they neared a small rise in the sand, Dakota's eyes caught sight of something in the distance. It was barely visible at first, a shadow against the horizon, but as they drew closer, it became clearer, a figure walking alone across the desert. Dakota's heart skipped a beat. The figure was human, a lone figure in the vast emptiness of the desert. His first instinct was to turn away, to avoid the stranger, but something inside him told him to stay. The other horse stopped beside him, its head raised, nostrils flaring as it took in the scent of the stranger. Dakota hesitated, unsure of what to do. He had been abandoned here once before by a man who had no regard for his life. Could this stranger be different? He took a step forward, and then another, the other horse following. The figure grew closer, and soon Dakota could make out the features of the man, a tall, weathered rancher, his face shaded by a wide-brimmed hat. The stranger looked down at them, his expression unreadable. Dakota's heart raced as he wondered what the man would do. Would he abandon them like the other rancher had done? Or would he offer help? To his surprise, the rancher didn't move to shoo them away. Instead, he reached into his bag and pulled out a canteen, offering it to Dakota with a silent gesture. Dakota hesitated for a moment before taking the water, feeling the cool liquid slide down his throat. It was the first refreshment he had had in days. "Thought I'd find you out here," the man said, his voice gravelly but kind. "Wasn't sure if you'd make it." Dakota's eyes widened. "You knew?" he asked, his voice rough with the strain of days without proper care. The rancher nodded, his gaze steady. "Yeah, I've been keeping an eye on you for a while. Saw what happened." Dakota didn't know what to say. The man had known about his abandonment and had witnessed it, but instead of turning away, he had returned to offer help. The rancher smiled, a faint, almost wistful expression on his face. "I've seen a lot of horses come and go, but there's something about you. You've got the spirit of a fighter." Dakota didn't know how to respond. His body was weak, but his heart was swelling with something new, gratitude, and perhaps even forgiveness. The past could never be erased, but this moment, this chance encounter, felt like a new beginning. With the water replenishing his strength, Dakota knew that he could keep going. This was his last chance to prove himself, and with the stranger's help, he would survive. The storm had passed, but the aftermath still lingered in the air. The world around them felt like a different place, one shaped by courage, determination, and an unexpected bond that neither Marley nor Gus had ever anticipated. The farm, once a place of desolation, now felt like a home where hope could grow. Marley stood at the edge of the barn, gazing out across the open field where Gus had once galloped freely, his coat shimmering under the bright morning sun. The winds had died down, and the earth had settled into a peaceful stillness. It was as if the world had been waiting for this moment, the final piece of a story still unfolding. Gus, the Mustang who had once been cast aside, now stood in the corral, a little slower perhaps, but still filled with the same fierce spirit Marley had witnessed that fateful day. The battle to save him had not been easy, and in some ways it was just the beginning. But Marley knew something now, something that went beyond the idea of ownership or care. It was a bond forged in the heat of struggle and sealed by the purest form of love. Marley turned to the barn door, where his father, still holding a deep level of skepticism about the Mustang's place on the farm, was watching from the shadows. His face was unreadable, but Marley could see the change in him, the subtle, almost imperceptible way his father's eyes softened when they landed on Gus. "Maybe I've been wrong," his father said quietly. "I used to think it was just about working the land, get the job done, and don't ask for anything else. But maybe there's something about him." Marley didn't need to answer. The quiet truth hung between them, unspoken but understood. Gus wasn't just another horse. He was a survivor. He was living proof that hope could bloom even in the harshest conditions. And somehow, that truth had softened the older man's heart. Gus lifted his head and whinnied softly, a sound that seemed to carry the weight of everything they had endured. His eyes, still sharp despite the years of neglect, locked onto Marley with an intensity that made his heart swell. "Yeah, there's something about him," Marley said, the words coming out slower, more deliberate. "Something real." A long silence passed before his father finally spoke again. "You were right," his father said quietly. "I see it now. I see him, and I see you." Those words, simple as they were, struck Marley more deeply than anything his father had ever said. In a single moment, the walls that had once separated them seemed to crumble, revealing a relationship built on respect and understanding. Marley approached Gus, his hand reaching out. The Mustang stepped forward, his movements slow but steady. He seemed to trust Marley, not the wild creature who had once roamed alone, but a part of this farm, this family. Marley ran his fingers through Gus's mane, feeling the warmth of the horse's body, the heartbeat that had once seemed so distant now in perfect rhythm with his own. "I knew you could make it," Marley whispered, as though speaking to the Mustang and himself. And then, as if Gus understood the significance of the moment, he lifted his head high and let out a triumphant whinny that echoed across the quiet fields. The sound was one of victory, a declaration that they had overcome the impossible. But it wasn't just Gus who had triumphed. Marley had to, too. He had fought for something that many had said was lost, and in the end, it wasn't just about saving a horse, it was about saving a part of himself, a part of his heart that had learned to believe in the extraordinary. The storm had passed, but the sky above them was brighter than it had ever been. The journey ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be more struggles and more battles to face. But Marley knew one thing for sure: as long as he had Gus by his side, they could face anything together. And so, with the Mustang standing proud, Marley stood tall beside him, knowing that the impossible had already been overcome. Together, they had created a new story, a story of survival, transformation, and, above all, love. In the end, Marley proved that no matter the odds, the will to live and the power of compassion can change everything. Gus may have made mistakes, but he learned the true meaning of redemption, and so did Marley. Together, they taught us all a valuable lesson in hope and second chances. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel, like this video, and share it with someone who needs a reminder of the power of resilience. Don't miss out on more incredible tales like this one.